The empire, once a symbol of unimaginable power, now lay in ruins. Stretching across galaxies, it had been the most formidable force in the known universe. With planets under its control, species bound by its rule, and a wealth of resources unmatched by any other civilization. But time, as it often does, had worn away at its foundation. The Empress declined. Once, the Empress Zorathyra had been a living legend. Her name known in every corner of the empire, a ruler whose command could move stars and whose decisions shaped the destiny of billions. But age and illness had caught up with her. What was once a strong and vital monarch now sat at the throne, frail and weak, her body slowly succumbing to a mysterious illness that no one seemed able to cure. Her mind, sharp as ever, still bore the weight of the empire's history and future, but her health was slipping beyond repair. The court physicians were powerless. The best doctors from across the galaxy could offer only temporary relief, and every attempt to cure her had failed. Zorathyra had watched as the once proud empire began to crumble around her, a reflection of her own slow decline. Without the strength to maintain order, her empire's vast territories had fractured into competing factions. Governors once loyal to the crown now fought for control, each seeking power over the decaying territories. The state of the empire, the once unified galaxy, had become a patchwork of weak alliances and territorial disputes. The grand fleets, which had once patrolled the borders with unmatched might, now were little more than a collection of ships with outdated technology and poor morale. The bureaucracy that kept the empire running had dissolved into infighting, corruption, and inefficiency. The lower classes, neglected for centuries in favor of the empire's elite, now began to rise in rebellion, challenging the very notion of imperial rule. Trade routes, once the lifeblood of the empire, were now under constant threat of piracy and disruption. Key systems had fallen into anarchy, their economies ruined. The grand citadels on distant worlds, once centers of culture, technology, and prosperity, were now overrun by mercenaries, warlords, and desperate survivors. It was a dying empire, and the once immense capital, Clyrath, stood as a solemn monument to that decline, its spires fading into the endless black of space. Humanity's unexpected role. In the midst of this chaos, humanity, once a relatively insignificant species at the fringes of the empire, had begun to emerge as an unexpected force. Earth, long known for its resourcefulness and adaptability, had become a key player in the empire's trade and military network. While the great houses of the empire squabbled over territory and power, humans proved they could do what no one else could: adapt and thrive in even the harshest conditions. Humanity had been a quiet but steady force, sending explorers, engineers, and diplomats to the far reaches of the empire. Over the past few decades, they had demonstrated an uncanny ability to repair the empire's decaying infrastructure, revive mining operations in abandoned sectors, and restore order to regions that had long been neglected. The human trade alliances had grown stronger, and their ships, smaller but more versatile than the aging imperial fleets, had begun to patrol distant worlds, securing peace where the empire could not. Yet despite these successes, humanity was still a relatively young power in the galaxy, with limited political influence. The other species of the empire, some ancient, some technologically superior, looked upon them with disdain, unwilling to acknowledge the potential of this upstart species. But the Empress, as her strength faded, began to look elsewhere for a solution, and she found it in the most unlikely of places: the last breath of the Empress. In her final days, as the Empress' condition worsened, the High Council convened in secret. It was a last-ditch attempt to save the empire from disintegration. The ruling families were divided. Some wanted to install a new ruler, others wanting to abandon the empire altogether. But there was one option they hadn't considered: an outsider, a human who had become well known for his diplomatic efforts and innovations. His name was Alistair Kane, an emissary from Earth, whose reputation had spread throughout the empire for his ability to broker deals and resolve conflicts where no one else could. Alistair had never aspired to power. He was, in his mind, a servant to the empire, a man who understood that diplomacy and compassion could rebuild what force and tyranny had destroyed. But the dying Empress saw in him something more than just a diplomat. She saw in him the key to saving what was left of her reign, and perhaps the empire itself. In a private meeting, surrounded by the remnants of her most trusted advisors, Zorathyra made a decision that would change the course of history. With her last breath, she summoned Alistair to the capital. As he arrived at her deathbed, Zorathyra's pale hands reached out, placing an ancient golden medallion into his palm. "Save us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rekindle a flame. Humanity will carry our legacy." The Empress closed her eyes, her reign ending with a single, peaceful breath. Alistair, now burdened with the weight of the galaxy's future, stepped into a role he never sought, a role that would challenge everything he knew about leadership, diplomacy, and survival. The Empire's fate was now in his hands, and the last breath of the Empress echoed in his mind as he faced an uncertain future. The morning after the Empress's death was shrouded in silence. The Imperial Palace, once a symbol of regal opulence and power, now felt like a hollow shell, abandoned by its lifeblood. The courtiers, the generals, and the nobles gathered in small, tense groups, whispering among themselves. But in the quietest chambers of the palace, Alistair Kane stood alone, reflecting on the weight of his new responsibility. He hadn't asked for this role. He hadn't wanted it. Alistair had spent his life in the service of diplomacy, of keeping the peace, of bridging gaps between species. He had never considered that his work would one day lead to him inheriting an empire on the brink of collapse. And yet, here he was, the last hope for an empire that had once been magnificent and now teetered on the edge of oblivion. A diplomat's mission. Alistair stood in the ancient council chamber, its walls adorned with frescoes depicting the empire's greatest victories. The High Council had gathered once again, but this time they weren't debating the usual trivialities of governance. They were looking at him, the human emissary, as if he were their last chance. He had met many of the council members before, though never in such a high-stakes context. There was Jurin, the leader of the Vrakian Alliance, a species whose cold, calculating demeanor had made him a powerful player in the Empire's military decisions. Then there was Queen Shava, the ruler of the Lyrian Dominion, her people known for their mysticism and ancient technology. And, of course, there was Lord Adran, a member of the Empress's own inner circle, who had long been skeptical of humanity's rise, but now looked to Alistair with wary eyes. "We must act quickly." Jurin's voice broke the silence, his tone crisp and commanding. "The loss of the Empress leaves a vacuum, one that we cannot allow to remain unfilled for long. The galaxy will descend into chaos without strong leadership. But what of the humans?" Lord Hadran interjected, his skepticism evident. "They're a resourceful species, but can they really lead an empire as vast as ours?" Alistair felt the weight of the council's gaze. He knew their doubts. Many had never fully accepted humanity's role within the empire, viewing them as a convenient tool, nothing more. But things had changed. The empire's collapse was inevitable without fresh thinking, without someone who could see beyond the ancient structures that had once held everything together. "It's not about leading in the traditional sense," Alistair began, his voice steady but firm. "It's about uniting the disparate factions, restoring what can be saved, and most importantly, moving the empire into the future. We're not just diplomats. Humanity is a species that understands survival, that adapts, that innovates." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The old ways haven't worked. The empire needs a new direction. We need to recognize that if we are to survive, we have to change. I can help you do that." There was a heavy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the chamber's energy crystals. For a moment, Alistair thought they would reject him outright. But then, to his surprise, Queen Shava spoke. "You're right," she said, her voice rich with thought. "We are at a crossroads. The Empress's death has shown us how fragile our empire really is. Perhaps it is time to listen to a new voice." Her words carried weight, and as if on cue, the rest of the council members began to murmur in agreement. The challenges of unity. Alistair knew that this was only the beginning. He was given full authority to begin his mission, but with that authority came immense pressure. He would have to unite not only the fragmented political factions, but also the countless species, each with its own interests, traditions, and values. Many of these species had been part of the empire for centuries, while others were newly integrated or only loosely allied. The divide between them was more than just political. It was cultural, psychological, and historical. His first challenge was the empire's military. The once mighty fleets were now fragmented, with factions loyal to their own commanders and agendas. Without a unified military, no peace would last. Alistair needed to find a way to integrate them, to form a coalition force that could act as a stabilizing force throughout the galaxy. Alistair's first visit was to the fleet's main command station on Zareth 5, a world on the Empire's outer rim. It was a bastion of Imperial tradition, and its admiral, Talaris Vor, was a staunch defender of the old ways. He had no love for humans, seeing them as upstarts who had risen too quickly for comfort. But Alistair knew that the future of the Empire rested on convincing Talaris that unity was the only way forward. Admiral Vor, I know your pride in the military's legacy, Alistair began, as the two men stood on the observation deck overlooking a massive fleet of ships. But the old ways can no longer hold the Empire together. We need a new kind of force, one that is flexible, adaptive, and united. Talaris's cold eyes glinted in the dim light. And what makes you think your human tactics will work where centuries of military tradition have failed? Alistair stood tall, meeting the Admiral's gaze. Because we know how to evolve. We know how to adapt. The Empire has stagnated. Talaris. If we don't change, we will die. For a long moment, Talaris said nothing, but at last he nodded, albeit reluctantly. Very well, he said, his voice grudging. But you will have to prove that your methods can work. The fleet will follow you, if you can earn our trust. The power struggle. While the military was a significant part of the equation, it wasn't the only challenge Alistair faced. The court itself was full of scheming and infighting. Old alliances that had once been unbreakable were now fragile. The noble houses that had supported the Empress for decades now saw her death as an opportunity to seize more power. In the midst of this, Alistair found an unlikely ally, Lord Hadran, the very man who had once doubted humanity's role in the Empire. Hadran, however, had seen firsthand the way humanity's ingenuity had begun to turn the tide on several worlds. He saw potential in Alistair, a man who was willing to listen to new ideas. The factions will never agree on their own, Hadran confessed one evening, after hours of tense meetings with rival lords. You need to give them a reason to believe in the Empire again. Alistair nodded, understanding the weight of Hadran's words. And that's where humanity's strength lies, he replied. We can offer them something new, something that's worth fighting for. The days following the first steps toward unity were tumultuous, filled with both progress and setbacks. The task before Alistair came was gargantuan, rekindling the dying ember of an empire that had once ruled the galaxy, but was now fractured beyond recognition. Yet, amidst the chaos, signs of hope began to emerge. Slowly, like the flicker of a candle in the dark, the possibility of rebirth became tangible, reforming the Empire's systems. The first reform Alistair implemented was one that many had long feared, restructuring the imperial bureaucracy. The Empire's administrative machinery, once vast and efficient, had become a labyrinth of inefficiency and corruption. Civil servants no longer worked for common good, but rather for the advancement of their own power. In a society built on patronage and nepotism, merit had become a rare commodity. Alistair knew that before anything else could be achieved, the systems that governed the Empire needed to be reformed. He began by creating an entirely new system of governance, a council of rebuilding that would include representatives from every corner of the Empire, including the humans. The council would oversee all aspects of imperial governance, from trade to security, with an emphasis on transparency, accountability, and fairness. But it wasn't enough to merely form a council. Alistair knew the people of the Empire had to see that this new order was real. So he traveled to the outlying worlds that had long been abandoned by the imperial court. Worlds like Naragon 8, a barren planet once home to a thriving mining colony, now reduced to dust and ruins. There, he saw firsthand the devastation that had resulted from years of neglect. The people of Naragon 8 greeted Alistair with suspicion. They had heard promises of reform before, only to see them broken by the bureaucracy's apathy. But Alistair wasn't there to make empty promises. He helped broker a deal between the local mining guilds and the new council, ensuring that the wealth generated from the planet's resources would go directly back into rebuilding the infrastructure. For the first time in years, the people saw real change. This small victory would prove to be a cornerstone in his broader efforts to reform the Empire's systems. Alistair's reforms were not universally accepted, of course. Powerful factions within the Old Guard, including some of the Empress's most loyal advisors, saw the changes as a direct threat to their power. But as the people of the Empire began to see tangible benefits from new policies, reduced corruption, improved public services, and a renewed sense of hope, the resistance slowly began to fade. The Empress' last act. Amidst all the political maneuvering and reform, one pivotal moment stood out. Empress Zorathyra's final act. As her health continued to decline, she was confined to her chambers, rarely seen in public. The world had already begun to turn its eyes toward Alistair, but the Empress still held symbolic power, a final connection to the Empire's glorious past. Her advisors, including Lord Hadran, urged her to take a more active role in the transition, but Zorathyra's time had passed. In a final, quiet ceremony, the Empress formally abdicated, passing on the mantle of leadership to Alistair. With her last breath, she issued a decree that would echo across the Empire's future. Let this empire no longer be ruled by one, but by many. Let humanity's ingenuity guide us into a future where all species can thrive. Let our differences be our strength. With this act, the Empress sealed humanity's place in the future of the Empire, and Alistair found himself not just leading, but carrying the weight of an entire civilization's hope for redemption. A new hope. As the news of the Empress's death and Alistair's ascension spread across the galaxy, reactions were mixed. Some factions saw the move as an inevitable necessity, a natural progression in the face of an empire that could no longer be saved by the old ways. Others, however, feared the rise of humanity. Could they truly steer the empire back from the brink? Could they maintain the delicate balance of power that had sustained the empire for centuries? Alistair's first act as a de facto leader was to address the galaxy in a broadcast that would be heard across every inhabited world. Standing in the ruins of the Grand Palace, Alistair spoke with conviction, but also humility. "We stand at the edge of history," he said. "What we decide today will echo across the centuries. The Empire is not dead. It is merely in need of rebirth. A rebirth that must come not from the ashes of the past, but from the hearts and minds of those who believe that together we can rise again." The speech was broadcast to every corner of the Empire, from the opulent cities of the Central Worlds to the desolate outposts on the galaxy's fringes. And for the first time in years, the people of the Empire began to believe. News from frontiers came in. Mining colonies were revived, trade routes reopened, and peace was restored to worlds once torn apart by rebellion. There was a tangible shift in the galaxy, as species long divided by centuries of mistrust began to look at one another with a new sense of possibility. The first signs of prosperity were small but significant. A colony on the fringe of the Empire, which had been on the brink of collapse, saw its economy soar after Alistair brokered a deal to restore interplanetary trade. A once ravaged world, devastated by years of civil war, was now beginning to rebuild its cities and infrastructure. And on Earth, humanity saw a newfound respect in the eyes of other species, no longer viewed as mere outsiders, but as key players in the Empire's future. But this new hope was not without its challenges. The political factions within the Empire, though temporarily united, still harbored deep divides. Old enemies lurked in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The military, while now united under Alistair's leadership, had not yet been fully integrated. Alistair's reforms had begun to heal the wounds of the Empire, but he knew that the true test would come when the Old Guard made their move. The road ahead. Alistair had no illusions about the road ahead. While the first signs of recovery were promising, the Empire's survival depended on much more than political reforms. The fractured systems, the lingering mistrust between species, and the looming threat of those who would rather see the Empire burn than change, these were all forces Alistair would have to face. But as he stood in the heart of the Empire's capital, watching the first ships of the new fleet take off, Alistair felt a surge of hope. The Empire was not yet saved, but it was no longer dying. It was beginning to live again. The galaxy had watched with bated breath as the Empire's old order crumbled and a new hope emerged from the ashes. Yet as the weeks and months passed, the weight of leadership continued to press down on Alistair Kane. The task of uniting a fractured empire, of rekindling its former glory, had only just begun. The flame had been reignited, but its future was still fragile. It was not just a matter of restoring what had been lost. It was about navigating complexities of power, legacy, and the uncertain road ahead. The death of the Empress. The passing of Empress Zorathyra had been a quiet affair, marked by solemn ceremonies across the empire. Though her body had been laid to rest, her spirit lingered in the hearts and minds of the people. The Empress had been more than a ruler. She had been a symbol of stability, of strength. Her death had signified the end of an era, but also marked the beginning of something entirely new. It was not just her passing that had shaken the galaxy. It was the knowledge that the old ways had failed, and the Empire needed to adapt or perish. For Alistair, the Empress' death was a profound moment of reflection. She had entrusted him with the future of the Empire, and now he had to carry forward her vision, even as it diverged from the path she had once led. Zorathyra's final decree, her recognition of humanity's potential to guide the Empire, was a gift and a burden. Alistair had always known that he could never fill her shoes, but now, with her legacy as both a guide and a cautionary tale, he had to forge his own path. The struggle for continuity. The death of the Empress had left a power vacuum that many sought to fill. The galaxy, while beginning to stabilize under Alistair's reforms, was still rife with factions that saw the new order as their opportunity to grasp power. In the central worlds, the old noble families, some who had supported the Empress's reign and others who had long plotted for her downfall, now eyed the seat of power with a mix of hope and fear. Many still questioned Alistair's ability to lead, especially given his status as an outsider. Could a human truly guide the Empire? Could someone so new to power carry the weight of the galaxy's fractured dreams? In the heart of the Empire, the political factions had become more vocal in their resistance to Alistair's reforms. Some argued that the Empire's traditions, its ancient systems of governance and military hierarchy, were what had made it strong. Others feared that humanity's influence would dilute the Empire's essence, making it a shadow of its former self. Alistair found himself increasingly pulled between two opposing forces: the desire to honor the Empress' legacy and the need to move forward with humanity's innovative approach to governance. One particular faction, led by the aristocratic House of Thalrex, called for the return to the old ways. They viewed the Empress' abdication as a tragedy and demanded that the Empire return to its roots, where a single, powerful ruler held absolute authority. For them, humanity's presence in the Empire was a passing trend, something to be tolerated but not celebrated. Alistair knew that this was a battle he could not afford to lose. If the Empire were to survive, it would need to evolve, not just politically, but culturally and socially. He had to convince the people that the future of the Empire was not about returning to the past, but embracing a new model of leadership that celebrated unity over division, cooperation over conquest. To this end, Alistair sought to formalize a Council of Rebuilding, an institution that would give voice to all species, all cultures, and all factions. The Council would oversee not only governance, but also the Empire's future direction, ensuring that the legacy of the Empress lived on through collaboration, not domination. But the House of Thalrex, along with other factions, was not easily swayed. Their influence, both political and military, remained strong, and Alistair knew that any push for true reform would be met with fierce resistance. As tensions escalated, he found himself at a crossroads, between consolidating power for himself or ensuring that the power of the Empire was shared among its diverse peoples. The new Empire. With time, the tides of change began to turn in his favor. The people, once weary of broken promises, began to see the difference between the old, hollow promises of reform and the real change Alistair was ushering in. On worlds that had once felt abandoned by the Empire, humanity's influence was being felt most strongly. People who had never dreamed of seeing prosperity again now found themselves rebuilding their cities, repurposing old technologies, and reviving ancient practices that had been forgotten for generations. A new generation of leaders began to rise from the ashes of the old empire, leaders who shared Alistair's vision of a united, forward-looking empire. While the old aristocracy still clung to their power, the winds of change could not be denied. The youth of the empire, born of a new age, began to look to Alistair as a figure of hope, not a usurper. They saw the Empire as something to be built, not something to be preserved at all costs. In the military, where skepticism of humanity's leadership had once run high, Alistair's reforms began to take root. The once disjointed fleets, now unified under a single banner, began to reflect the Empire's new values. Where once loyalty had been based on fear or tradition, now it was based on mutual respect and the belief that the future was worth fighting for. Alistair knew that while the military was a key pillar of his vision, it was the people, those on the ground in the colonies and the factories and on the farthest edges of the galaxy, who would truly determine the Empire's fate. For the first time in years, there was a real sense of unity. Humanity, once seen as outsiders, were now a part of the Empire's foundation. And Alistair, the human diplomat who had once been considered an unlikely candidate to lead the Empire, now stood as the linchpin of its future. His leadership, guided by the Emperor's final wishes, had transformed him from an emissary to a symbol of hope, a bridge between the past and the future. The legacy of the Empress. As the Empire began to rebuild, Alistair found himself returning often to the place where it all began, the Empress's tomb. He would stand in front of her final resting place, reflecting on the weight of the responsibility she had placed upon him. Though she was gone, her influence still lingered in every decision he made, in every step forward the Empire took. The Empress had always believed that the strength of the Empire lay not in the power of one, but in the cooperation of many. In her final moments, she had recognized that humanity was a spark needed to rekindle the flame of the Empire. But it was the people of all species, background, and histories who would be the ones to carry that flame forward. As Alistair stood in the quiet of the tomb, he realized that the true legacy of the Empress was not her reign, but her willingness to let go of it. In her death, she had given the galaxy a chance to renew itself, a chance to build something new from the ruins of the past. And in that moment, Alistair knew that the Empire was no longer just hers or his. It belonged to everyone, human and alien alike. The road ahead was still uncertain. The Empire was still fragile, and there were challenges yet to come. But as long as humanity's vision and the Empress' legacy continued to guide the galaxy, there was hope for the future.